Hello, welcome to another Random Code stream. My name is Jason Bach. I'm going to be working on this issue, which got reported yesterday, and I thought, man, this is going to be a lot of work. Hey, the code guy. By the way, I just saw you come into the Discord server, so cool. So I saw this issue come in, and I thought, man, might be a lot of work. But then sometime randomly last night, I realized, I think I can fix this with literally one line of code. So we might spend some time adding more tests to this source generator, and for a whole different reason. And I'll explain that in just a moment. Let me get my music going first. All right. What is this? This is a custom serializer for a library called CSLA that has been around for a long time. I think the first versions of the library were started in the mid 90s, and it's been updated and modernized throughout the years. So, hey, Electron. And what I'm doing here is the library gives you a way to serialize what are called business objects. These are custom types in the framework. And I wrote a source generator based version of a serializer. So it's turned out to be a lot faster and consumes a lot less memory than the one that comes out of the box. So it's been fun working on that. 30 years of experience. Yeah, well, I started as a software developer out of college in 1995, out of grad school. So I've been around for a while. I don't consider myself old, but I'm getting oldish. I guess it's all relative in how you think of it. All right. So before I go through this, though, I do want to spend just a little bit of time looking at something that I thought was interesting, which is there's this repository out there called Benchmark MockNet. And what this library or what this repository does is it has a whole bunch of performance tests around different mocking libraries that are in .NET, like MOQ and Substitute, Fake It Easy, and mine, again, another source generator based one. That's called Rocks. And I added my test to it years ago, and surprisingly, it was faster than the other ones. And once source generators became a thing, then I changed it to the source generator. It became extremely fast. And so it's been interesting to watch these tests and their performance characteristics change. Now, recently, the guy who owns this repository changed it. This is the one that was done. This is just over a year ago. Okay. And then I'm going to compare it to what is out there now. So this was just done a couple weeks ago. So this is actually targeting, I believe, .NET 10 now. And what I think is interesting is that if you look at, there's different scenarios, but I'll just look at this one parameter one, is if you notice, and it might not be that easy to see, but I'm just going to pick out this one library, just mock light. So it takes that many nanoseconds to run. I'll answer your question in a moment, a second, Electron. So 35,000 nanoseconds, 36,000 to 25,000. Okay. And it's not just this library. Like if you look at any of them, and substitute now is 46 nanosecond, 4600. It used to be 5200. Every single one of these and every single test, I think, when I looked at them, all the libraries got slightly faster, going from .NET 9 to .NET 10. And their memory allocation, if you look at just Mach Lite, now is like 20K, 21K. It's very close to that, but it is slightly less. It's not that big of a jump, but if you look at the allocated numbers, like for Fake It Easy, it used to be that. Now it's this. So what I think this is interesting in from my perspective is just by going from .NET 9 to .NET 10, this is some anecdotal evidence to indicate that you're going to get better performance and less allocation. Now, that's a general statement. That's not a guarantee. So, you have to look at a whole bunch of things. But you look at the articles that I keep bringing these up by Stephen Taub, T-O-U-B, who writes these performance improvement articles for .NET and whatever the new version is. And these things are huge monster articles that have so much detailed information in it. But it also shows that if you just upgrade, you don't do any changes to your code, you just upgrade to the new version, you will probably get some performance benefits. And again, you may not notice them. Like going from, if you were using rocks, in this one case, it was 540 nanoseconds and now it's 390 nanoseconds. You're not going to notice that. And especially with these kinds of frameworks, mocks are only used in tests and they should be used sparingly. Even as the author of one of these frameworks, I don't think if you're using these a lot, you're probably using them way too much. But if you had some code that was on a hot path that had something addressed with it from version 9 to version 10, and then you upgraded your code, you might see your code act a little bit better. These death by 1,000 paper cuts go away, and now you suddenly start to see this overall characteristic of things getting slightly better. So I find that interesting. How was your journey? Geez, how do I compress 30 minutes or 30 years into 30 seconds? I'll try to do this as fast as I can. I started as my first role was programmer, and it was for a company called Quad Graphics, and did that for about a year and a half. And then I heard about this thing called consulting, and you make more money doing consulting. That was literally the only thing that that made me think about it, as I started seeing people move towards that. And so I joined a company called Keen, and I did that for about a year and a half or two. And then I joined a smaller local consulting company called High Gear, which they're not around anymore. And that was for another year and a half or 2 years. And then I moved up to Minnesota. At the end of 2000, I joined a software consulting company called Magenic. And I worked for them for almost 20 years. I did leave after about a year and a half. I joined a company called Intertech, and that was the one that I was fired from. So yay. That only lasted 6 months, but as soon as they let me go, I called Magenic and said, hey, can I come back? And within a week, I was back working there, and was there overall for 20 years. And then in the summer of 2020, I joined Rocket Mortgage, and that's where I've been for almost 6 years now. What problems do you face? So many. I actually have kept notebooks. I used to do that when I would do work. Now I don't. If I'm taking notes, I actually will just use VS Code and write stuff in Markdown down, because then I can save them. But I used to keep very copious notes, or at least anything that I needed to think about during the day. And I still have all these notebooks. I should go back and look at like what clients I was at, what kind of verticals of it. But I worked in companies that handled retail, medical, construction, HVAC, farming equipment, financial. It's so much. It goes across so many different verticals and different problem spaces and stuff like that. So it runs the gambit. At starting, I don't know what you mean by at starting Electron. Sorry. But that is the one thing. I mean, I like where I work now. I like it. And it is a very different experience because it's the first, well, Quad Graphics was a big company, but that was like 30 years ago. And for 20 years when I worked at Magenic, it only got to about 1,000 people, give or take, at its height before it got sold. It was sold a year after I left and I went to Rocket Mortgage. Going to a company like Rocket Mortgage, it was a big change because it's going to a company that now has like tens of thousands of people that creates commercials for the Super Bowl. That just is like, what? I've never experienced that before. But being in a company like Rocket Mortgage deals with mortgages, it's a financial company. And when you're a consultant, you can end up going to, the one nice thing I liked about that is you got the ability to work at so many different companies, see so many different problems in so many different verticals. It was really interesting that way. If you want to suggest something to a beginner, what would it be? Like as a career option? My career path and what people do now is very different. Some people used to think, and even this is going away now, the whole Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, you got to go work for one of those companies. Those are the only serious ones, or work for a startup. I personally never really had any interest in that. I've interviewed a couple times at Microsoft and never got an offer. It just never materialized for various reasons. And quite frankly, I think in retrospect, it probably was a better thing. Not that I'd have to move out there, but I value my time, and I really don't find a lot of value in having to work an ungodly number of hours. And I'm not saying everybody at Microsoft or any of these companies do, but they do. And I have a family. My kids are now adults. So they have their own lives. Even though they still live here, but they have their own lives. And I'm not responsible for them anymore from that perspective. So, my kids are grown up. I don't have to be around them as much, and it sounds bad, but I mean it. Like, I don't have to watch them. I don't have to make sure that things are going okay and everything like that. My wife and I have been married for almost 29 years now, and we get along really well, and it's a very different experience for me right now. I just like my own time. I don't throughout my whole career, I never really had to do a ton of overtime, but a couple of projects I did, and I don't want to say it wasn't worth it. Like one of them, I had to work, God, it was one summer and it was so many hours. And the end result of the project was very successful and all this stuff, but I'd be very hard pressed to do that. Again, I love what I do, but I don't like working in what I consider very tense conditions and pressures. I don't find that very conducive to building good stuff. What job do your kids have? My older kid isn't working right now, and that needs to change. I'll just leave it at that. But my younger kid works at a grocery store. And, that's the other thing, too, that was different for my wife and I. Going to college for both of us was financially not ruinous. And you didn't have to take out a 6-figure loan to go to college. These days, it's insane how expensive post-high school education is. Even if you go to like a community college, it is unreal. And to me, it's extremely disappointing to see that. Neither one of them had any real interest in going to college. And that alone was like, well, then don't go, because why would you spend that much money on a 4-year degree where you really don't want to even be there? That's just, it doesn't make sense to me. So, and I'm fine with that. Like I've always told them, I'm like, I don't care what you do with your life, so long as it's not illegal and you can end up supporting yourself and you're generally happy with it. I don't think that necessarily you have to say, well, either I love my job or I'm not going to work. Well, that's not the way the world works. You sometimes have to do things that you don't like, but it's to keep a roof over your head and food on the table. So yeah, my wife works. She did it when we had kids. We're in a very fortunate position that she didn't have to when we had our kids and they were growing up. But even as our kids started to, get older-ish, she would start to, I think she would work like a couple of hours for a couple of days at elementary school that's just close by. And then she ended up starting to work there part-time, and then she got a full-time job there. And then she went to another school, and now she's been at another school for like 2 years and working full-time. So, yep. Right. By the way, I want to get to fixing this thing. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. I would really appreciate it. All right, let me actually fix this bug because it's interesting. This bug was, again, I really appreciate that this person, I'm not trying to call them out, that they have submitted bugs and pull requests to this project. It's really helpful that people, not that they care enough about this thing that they're like, hey, there's issues with it. And I'm like, that's great. I have absolutely no problem with it. But I think one of the things that I've noticed when this person's submitting bugs is that they're not descriptive enough. And it's like, if there's one thing I want to tell people is if you're going to try to help with a project, is think about, if you saw something like this, would it be enough for you to go, okay, I could, or somebody else could run with it? I wasn't able with these two comments to go, well, wait, what's the issue? And I finally dug into it. Why your stream duration? Well, part of it is for coding streams, I try to keep them in the hour because, over that way is my day job. And I do want to make sure that I get started on that. I don't have to clock in or anything like that, but it's a typical 8-hour day, and I don't want to push it farther than that, later on into the day. So I do want to get started typically around 8 or 8:30. And so I usually limit it to that. I've also found with like gaming streams, just concentration wise, getting up around 3 hours is going to start to tax me. It just, I need to take a break from it after that amount of time. When I do coding streams, I feel like after about an hour and a half, it's just that's a good amount. It's not that I will never go over that, but I typically keep them that. It's just what I feel like is a reasonable length for me to keep my concentration up in what I'm talking about. So there's no other reason other than that. So the reason this problem is coming up is because for whatever reason, this person is creating interfaces that derive from this interface that's in CSLA. And that's basically the trigger for my serializer to go, if your object derives from this, then that means we can generate a class, a partial class, that does all this custom serialization stuff on it. He was adding it onto an interface. And I was like, well, that doesn't make sense. Because interfaces can have implementation, to be fair. You can do that in C#. But I'm kind of like, I don't think that's what we should be targeting. It should only be for a class. And I think even the code that I generate for, in fact, if I look at the generator itself and I look at what I build here, we do this stuff. We say the namespace if we need it. So we do say here this. We're going to have to change this. But I'm like, it doesn't make sense for it to be an interface, because why would you implement that? So I thought, well, okay, we're going to have to go through all this code that now says if it's targeting an interface, we don't want you to do that, or to ignore it. And they put in a test for it. And they actually made a pull request, and I took this one test out and said, this is what the problem is. And it's actually for a code fix. The code fix is, there's a code fix that I have, and I don't remember why. But it was a problem because it's casting to a class declaration syntax node. But yeah, it should be like, this should not be for interfaces. And then I think something triggered in my head last night, and I went, wait a minute. All we need to do is go to this attribute itself. Where is it? Here. Take that off. And we're done. So now you can't even target an interface with this anymore. So that won't even work. And there's no reason to test that, because I'm not interested in testing what you can or can't do in C# itself. That's like, I'm not testing, does attribute usage, attribute targets work or not. That's a compiler concern of mine. But now I know class is the only target, not an interface. And so actually what I can do here is take this off, because that's never going to happen. It's always going to be a class. Okay. And then from that point on, that's the only time we generate this. None of my tests should break. Well, some of my code might break. So interface data does not implement interface member. Well, it shouldn't. Interface test. So we do have a test for this, but now we're probably going to have to remove it. So that's in, wait, where is this? Integration tests. Graphs. Interface test. So yeah, I'm kind of like, so having that there doesn't make any sense. Oh, okay. See, this is why I think something's always going to be simpler, and then it isn't. The type I interface data is not marked with generator serializer attribute. Which is true, and I think this is now getting to what this person was saying, is if you have interfaces like this, the analyzer is coming back and saying, hey, you really should put that attribute on it. So now we need to change the analyzer so that it doesn't target interfaces. It's only looking for class types. Okay. So, I know. This always is the way it goes, right? So this analyzer, what this is doing is it's looking at your code to saying, hey, if you have a business object derives from my mobile object, you should put that attribute on it, because then your code just gets like a one and done update with the code fix to get all the attributes on them. But what we should be doing here is saying if type symbol kind, is that a... There. Because we only care about classes. We don't care about interfaces. So now let's clean. Let's build again. I might need to reboot Visual Studio. I'm not sure. But it might pick, so now it picks it up. So now build succeeds. So even though this is a holdover, that's going to go away because the build succeeds. If I run all, you see now it went away. Now if I run all my tests, one failed. Okay, what failed? Oh, okay. This is the unit test version of that. We should not put that on there, and we should just say interface. We don't need to actually say they're partial. But this should be fine, right? Is it that it's not generating that file anymore? Yeah. Right, it's not generating this anymore, which it shouldn't have. Actually, what it was generating is just this without the, but that was not even needed. So we can just get rid of that and run this test. Still fails. Interesting. I don't think it's doing it wrong. It's actually doing the right thing. It's just weird that it picked up the change there. Oh, because it saw it before as implementing that interface, but iData doesn't do that anymore. And so now it's saying write it as a mobile object. That's actually interesting. How many times have I said, oh, this should be simple. This should be one line of code, and it ends up not being so much. If I back this out for just a second, what ended up happening is it says this type implements this, but it doesn't actually. Right. So we go through and generate this, but then we look at we only say if it's a class. Do we actually do any implementation? Huh. So this is the magic of Git. Okay. We're going to undo all this. Okay, and the reason we're undoing all this is because I'm now going to change what I think, which is fine. If I go back to my attribute here, it's now targeting interface. I think we can't remove that, because what I saw in the generated code is it said that there was a object of type iData. In fact, if I go back to this one here, because this is just an interface. And then we say data implements this. Which is fine. But then here we're saying we have a property that is of this iData type. We don't know that it implements this. And so in the generated code, when we get down to here, when we say the contents property, we're using the right, and we're using the write overload and the read overload, which will look at them, if I remember right. So if we go look at the reader context and we look at read, yeah, we're looking to say it's got to be of a class and an iGenerator serializable. So even though the interface type is an iData, something has to implement it. And so it has to be of this type. And so we're saying read it, and then we're going to actually call our getState method on it, or in the other way, the setState. When I took all that off, what my code actually did, which is the right thing, is it said, well, it's no longer, in this case, this property is just an iData. It didn't implement my interface, but it was implementing this base type. So the best thing I can do is try to serialize it as a mobile object, which is actually slower because we have to fall back in that case to what CSLA does with its mobile formatter. That's the default serialization engine, and that's not what we want. So yes, okay. And now I got my head around the problem better. We need to keep what's currently there, but we need to actually go back and say, if we run into the case where the original code, like this test shows, that it doesn't have the attribute on it, that to fix it, it's going to put the attribute on it. Got it. So it should do that, but we should have our code changed so that the code fix, and I think this is what the poster was getting to at the whole start of this, is that if we look at our code fix, we come in and we say, oh, well, it has to be a class declaration syntax. That's not true. It could be as interface declaration syntax as well. Okay, so the song made a great beat map. Actually, the songs that you hear in the background when I'm doing my coding streams, this is to avoid any copyright issues or anything like that. They're all songs I've written, and so it will loop. If you listen long enough, it loops like every 30 or 40 minutes. So these are all songs I've written in the past. And this one was actually, there's 3 of them are from some collaborations I've done with a guy named Mike Hodnick. And there's one that I wrote years and years ago when I was in college. And I mostly just have them in the background because they're instrumentals. They don't have any singing, so that can't distract. They're my songs, so we can't copyright strike them or anything like that. So, well, thank you. Appreciate that. And it's good to just have something playing, because if I stop talking, I don't want just dead noise, or dead air. And if I'm focusing on something, at least something is playing in the background. So anyway, all right. Yeah, I mean, if you look over my, what would be my right shoulder, you can see that I have a Marshall app over there. I don't really have much amps. If I did, at this point, I have more than enough musical equipment that I could ever. I'm looking over there, and I have like my drum set, guitars, basses, keyboards. I have more than I could possibly ever need. The one thing I might ever do is look at getting like a fractal amp or something like that, and instead of having like a amp like that, if I ever wanted to play out, because it would just be far easier to do that. Very good job. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. All right, so I think that's what the problem is. So we do want to take this test. Okay, and we want to go into where we have code fix tests. And we can just plop it down the bottom here. Just run on with the tests. Yeah, let's move that over a little bit. And then fix code. Wait. And so this should fix it by saying we will want this to be a partial interface. That's one thing our code fix doesn't. No, it does. Yes, it does do that because we force you to be partial, and because then that goes with the whole code fix solution wide. All right. I have to do this. Well, no, we'll do this. Because I have to. Okay. All right, so this is saying I'm going to target a customer. It should be a customer here. By any chance, could you send a link to this repo? Could I send a link? Yeah, give me a second. Let me. Oh, I'm sorry. I usually put the. Yeah, I'll do that in chat. I usually put in a link to the issue or issues that I plan on working on. So that's the link to the issue, and that'll get you to the repository. I usually put that in the description of the stream, and I just forgot this time. So, oops. Oopsie. I need to get in that habit of putting like links to stuff in my description, but I don't always remember to do that. Okay, so now this should actually fail because we haven't fixed anything yet. And this is probably going to show the error that the original report was giving, which is it's an invalid cast. Value cannot be null. Parameter syntax. Yes, because add code fix. Right, so if we go here and we look at add code fix, what is probably happening, let's make sure I get all my breakpoints deleted, is here, we put a breakpoint here, and then we come back to our, our test. What's happening here is probably it's not, yeah, it's null. But if we said here as interface declaration syntax, that's going to work. It realizes that. Okay. So, which is fine. We should be able to add the attribute add partial and check for using whether it's an interface or not. The thing we have to look at though is what's the common type between a class declaration. Oh, that's useful. What I just did is F12 into this, and with the source links that exist within GitHub and Microsoft and what it does, it's source linking to this file, but that's completely useless because it doesn't tell me what this derives from. And I know that derives from something. I know that there is a, if I go look at interface. Yeah, type declaration. I believe that is what both interface declaration and class declaration derive from. So that's goodish. Let's see. If I run this test now, what happens? Fails. But it fails because the diff is wrong. Okay, that's better. We can regenerate the diff. That's okay. And 1, 2, 3, that. Do that. Oops. There we go. Now if we run all of my tests, they all pass. That fixes the problem. And it actually is the right way to fix this. So what are some things I just showed? One, I'm always wrong if I think a fix is, or what I'm going to work on in this stream is going to be easy. It never ever is. It always ends up being harder than what I thought it was, or it's just the way to solve it is different than what I originally thought it would be. I thought, oh, I just make a target class, but this leads into the second thing: write tests. Because I had tests written around what you could do, that showed that removing the ability to target an interface with that attribute was not a good idea, or to remove that would have not been a good idea. What we really needed to do is just simply fix the code fix here so that the node that you're targeting in the syntax tree is more generalistic. It could be either an interface or a class, which is a type declaration syntax, because both of those derive from that. And now everything works. And I think that's a much better solution. Yippee. Fallout guy. So let's go to my changelog. And so we fix this. The code fix for adding generator serializable now works with interfaces. And this is 41. All right. I'm just going to do one more thing here real quick, which is shut down startup again. But I've noticed with Visual Studio 2026 that this gets a lot better with handling Roslyn-based projects in terms of reloading and updating things. But I just want to make sure that this is actually fixed. So we'll rerun all the tests. And they all pass. All right. 41. Updated or fixed. Code fixed. Updated. Change log. Time for merge. Okay, so let's just do this real quick before I forget. Push. All right. And then we can come back here and say, guess what? We're done. It's fixed. Nice. And once again, I like it when people help out on open source projects. You know, that's one of the things too that I think people still need to keep in mind is that if you're using any open source software and you're using it correctly according to the license, is don't expect free help. You know, if you find an issue with it, report it. You know, maybe say, hey, could I try fixing it? But you've already been granted or gifted all of this free implementation that somebody or people have put into that repository, and handle it with that mentality. Don't go in hot to a repository and say, hey, the company that I work for is like a multi-million or billion-dollar company, and this one little thing doesn't work, fix it or we're going to sue you, or, come on, what kind of support is this? That is what has burned out so many people on open source, because they do nothing but, you can say, well, if they wrote better software, they wouldn't have as many bugs, but everybody writes bugs, everybody, or you don't always have all the features that people want. It's evolutionary. It's always changing. Go in with grace, just realize that people have lives and that they're under no obligation to fix your bug yesterday, no matter how big of a company you are, so that's never happened to me in open source. There was a incident years ago when I published an article on some website for a product, doesn't matter what it is, and somebody ended up calling me on a Saturday, somehow found out my number, because back in those days you could look up people in phone books or whatever, somehow found my number, called me as I was going out the door to go to dinner with my wife, and then one of our nephews was over for that weekend, and we just wanted to take him out to dinner. So we're about to head out the door, and this guy calls me and got really insistent that he needed my help right away, because what my article talked about is what would solve his problem. So he really needs to get my help. And after about 3 times of trying nicely to tell him, send me an email because I'm about to go to dinner, but I can try to help you tomorrow if I have the time. This guy was getting very insistent, and I finally raised my voice and was like, look, I'm going to dinner. I am leaving. If you need help, send me an email, but I'm not going to do this now. Oh, okay. And then he sent me an email and he was like, I'm sorry, I really need to get this done. And I was like, look, people, if they want to help, but asking for that. So my experience with that was like already in the 90s. And I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to bend over backwards and try to help somebody out, especially when they're being demanding of free work. So anyway, let me answer this question. Then I'm actually pretty much at time. How exactly did you learn development back in the day? Did you take classes, read a bunch of books? Yes. There's just a lot of, and again, this is different than what people do now, for good, bad, or indifferent. But I've always loved reading books. I have way too many books in my house. I've come to the realization I'm never, I could live till I'm 90 and I'm never going to read all the books that I got. But I will, in all likelihood, donate them to libraries and things like that. I've always loved learning. I've always loved trying to understand how things are, And so part of it was just my own continual education out of college. I've always done that. And I think that's just a good thing to do no matter what your career is. Just keep learning. I don't know anything about a car. Okay, well, maybe watch some YouTube videos. Maybe get a book or two on like what's the ins and outs of an engine. Learn that and then maybe start tinkering with your car. And that's the only, and you might screw something up, but that's the only way you learn too, is you got to break things to make things. You gotta know what happens when you break stuff, and or look back on how you wrote code and go, wow, I definitely have learned from that. But yeah, a lot of it has just been my own self-education. In terms of college, I actually went to school for electrical engineering. Retrospect, I probably should have got a degree in computer science and or mathematics, but because that actually is what I was more interested in. But my master's degree, I wrote a thesis that was a lot of C code, and that's where I always knew I was going to do something with computers, but I think that's when I realized my career path should be with developing software. So, so yeah, that's kind of how I learned, and it's always learning. And I'll say this, that with the whole introduction of large language models, I still can't call it AI because I don't think it's not AI as I've always understood AI to be. I'm not saying it's useless. I'm just saying it's become a marketing term, and it really, like, I don't care when you're building your software or how things work to know it's infused with AI. I really don't care. I just want it to work well, work fast, work efficiently, and I like using what you built. That's what I really care about. I don't particularly care if you're using, agents, AI agents to do all this stuff. It's like, that doesn't, even as a software developer, I don't really care about that. As a consumer of things, I do care that it works well. That's what I do care about. So I think, unfortunately, people are rapidly moving towards, well, ChatGPT or Claude told me to do this or build this, and so therefore we're going with it. And I think that's a detriment. Not to say that you don't do that. Like, I use that at work because sometimes, especially for really simplistic, germane things, it can be a time saver. Why wouldn't I use that? So there are definitely cases where I think it's an aid and it's a useful tool. I don't think, and this is just my personal opinion, I don't think that we're going to get to the point, at least, and I know people disagree, but I don't see it to where you can remove humans from the loop. I don't see that happening anytime soon. Even if they get better and better and better, humans have to be responsible for what gets deployed, what gets built, what gets shipped to a customer or client. They just have to. And so you have to know what these things do. And to know what these things do, you have to have the knowledge of, like, for example, I'll give you just one example real quick. Recently, I was trying to fix a bug with one test we had in our test suite. It was only failing on my machine, a Windows machine. And we have somebody else in our team that also uses Windows. The other 3 developers use Macs, which is fine, whatever. But on the Mac machines, it wasn't failing. On our build system, it wasn't failing. Only on my Windows machine. On a Windows machine, it would. And couldn't figure out why. Long story short, I just on a whim, as I looked at it, I was like, I can't figure this out. And I said, well, just ask Claude. Go into Copilot and ask, hey, can you tell me what might be the reason for this? And it gave kind of a hand-wavy answer about that there's differences with how this code works between Mac and Windows, maybe, blah, blah, blah. But the real solution is to move some of the capturing of request headers at the beginning of the test, not at the end of the test. Then that fixed things, which is great, except for the tests. The code that that Claude generated was using a type that was read-only. And so when I copy-pasted the code in, I'm like, well, this won't work because this code you added at the top now is requiring me to add things to this dictionary, and I can't because it's read-only. And I put that back in the chat, and I was like, you're right, I didn't do that correctly. Generate code that is actually usable. Now, I have to say, this helped me fix the test, so I'm not dismissing it, but you also have to have the ability to go, and if you would have compiled it, it wouldn't have compiled because it, just wouldn't have worked. But don't just assume that what it's generating is going to be, or ever will always be, 100% correct. It's all this stuff is still coming from humans, and humans are fallible. We make mistakes. So one of the core tenets of software development is validate your input. Make sure that it is correct. And we can't lose sight of that or lose track of that. 18 is start getting programming. Windows 13, really seeing old school generation programs. Thanks. I think. I get the intent. A lot of us that have been around for a while too, like, I used to see people when I was like in my late 20s, early 30s. I remember meeting somebody who was like a mainframe developer and was hemming and hawing over all this web stuff and blah, blah, blah. And I said to myself, I don't ever want to get that way. I don't ever want to get that way as a software developer, as a person, to stop being curious, to stop being, interesting and looking at things. I will say though, now fast forward to I'm probably at the age of where that person was, that you start getting a little cynical of every news cycle of marketecture that comes into software development. And you start at least I do, my opinion is I do get cynical at times, because it's like it's the same thing as this, and that works. Why are we redressing this up as this just to like drum up sales? Can we spend more time building and expanding our craft and what we do as software developers, rather than just chasing the next marketing hotness? So there's some of that, no doubt about it. And I think also that there's a guy that I've listened to off and on throughout the years. His name is Henry Rollins, and I really love listening to his spoken word. I've gone to his spoken word shows a couple of times, and I personally really like him. I find him entertaining, but also very insightful. And he's now, I think, in his mid 60s. And, people mostly remember him as like writing this one song called Liar. And he's this really big buff guy. And he used to sing in Black Flag and all this stuff. But really sharp as a tack guy though, and he's just got this passion and fire to like keep learning and understanding and self-educating. And he said, I think he did, it's the episode where he's on Hot Ones or Hot Wings or whatever that YouTube series is. And he smashes it too. He like eats all of it, and he admits it's hot, but he handles it like a champ. But he said something in there at the end that basically he's like, with him being older and stuff like that, he goes, I'm no longer like trying to just decimate the forest in front of me. I'm more interested about being surgical as to what I chop down or, get rid of in the forest without just laying it all down. Be very precise as to what needs to be removed to make the forest healthier. And it's an older and wiser thing. Not to get upset at so many things and just figure out what is worth the time and what's worth spending the time on to fix. But I will say this too, with all these new tools, I would actually say to people, learn assembly. You're never going to use it, but it's kind of like learning how to build a car or how an engine works. Why not? Can't hurt. Oh, well, we know how this works. Yeah, but do you? Why not learn? Again, the curiosity. Do you really know what's going on underneath the scenes with computers? I don't. I mean, I know what assembly language is and probably a couple of codes, but it would be interesting just to go, how does this machinery all work? Learn a different programming language. You can't just say, well, let this generate all this stuff for me if you don't understand where this is coming from. I think that's going to bite you in the end. The analogy I heard, which I think is true, is you don't go to a gym with a forklift and you let that lift all the weights for you. If you're going to go to a gym, you're the one that's going to be running the track. You're the one that's going to be lifting the weights because you want to build that strength. You want to build that endurance. If I'm working in a warehouse and I need to move a whole bunch of stuff around, yes, I would use a forklift. Yes, I'm going to use these tools to make that faster and easier. Why wouldn't I? If I did that all myself, it would take so much more time. So you'd use those tools. I think the analogy holds for this. You still want to build your own mental muscles. You still want to build your own understanding of how things work. But when you're actually needing to build these things, if you know how to use the tools, if you know how to use a forklift correctly, then you can move a whole bunch of stuff around real quick and get a job done faster. If you don't know how to use it correctly, you could probably hurt yourself or others and break a whole bunch of stuff as well. So You have to still understand how these tools work and how they interact with your whole day. If you don't understand the code, it's generally best to not use AI. Yeah. On the other hand, if you do understand this, generally fine. Writing. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's a time saver. Even if it's not getting you 100% of the way, it's only getting you like 80 or 90% of the way. That's typically going to save you time, even if you have to clean some of it up. But that point is true. More rare. I hope I'm just gonna say Yo more I. Maybe that's how you say your name. But I think that is a true statement, and I agree with it. You have to understand what that code is doing. You have to understand how code works. You can't just go in and say generate, let it do it, and say, oh, I'm done. You have to have an understanding of how soft. You can't go to a whole bunch of robots and say, build me a car, and then hope that it works and it's not going to blow up as it goes off the assembly line. Maybe a bad analogy there, but I still think it somewhat holds. Anyway, good conversation. I do appreciate all this. I am going to stop the stream here, though, because I've got to go to the day job over there. So I want to thank everybody who showed up either now live or in the future. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. I am going to do a gaming stream tonight around 6:30 or 7 p.m. Central. Continuing on with Lego Lord of the Rings. Yep, kids game, but I'm having a fun time playing it. It's fun to play that game, so check that out if you'd like. And Guy, no, I'm not going to teach you Rust. Go away, Guy. I know, Guy. So you can give me that kind of grief. Why don't you teach me Rust? All I know is that there's things, that there's this whole concept of borrowing in Rust, and there's crates. That's their package system. That's all I know. But anyway, I am going to stop for now. So thank you all for watching. Take care, and I hope to see you in the future.